get started. Welcome, everybody. This is the second part of a two-part discussion on cybersecurity. This morning, we talked about current practices and issues with current practices, I would say. Fascinating panel. We went a little bit all over the map, I would say. We talked about various things. But today we want to look a little bit more forward and talk about trust. Specifically the trust between stakeholders. What makes and breaks that trust. I think that trust of end users is critical to the success of a global internet. A global open internet will not work if users don't trust that open internet. They will walk away from it, they will demand measures that will in the end close that open internet and put limits to permissionless innovation, put limits to global reach, put limits to the things that made the internet a great medium for us all. So that's my perspective. We have other perspectives around the table, I'm sure. And we've invited a number of great panelists to share their perspective. Louise Bennett from Vivas Limited, it's a consulting company, and from the British Computer Society. Is that a right summary of the job title?
Well, the British Computer Society is in fact a professional association and a charity. So volunteers like myself work for it pro bono on things that they think are important.
Next to me is Rainer Stenzel. He is with the German Federal Ministry. And there he is the head of the division that deals with police information systems. Is that correct?
And data protection.
And data protection. My colleague Marit Palvorita. I never know how to pronounce your name exactly. It's Finnish, so what can I say? But she's the manager of the European affairs at the Internet Society. And finally, Konstantinos Moulinos. He's with ENISA, where he is an expert in network and information security. My name is, by the way, Olaf Kolkman. I'm the Chief Internet Technology Officer of the Internet Society. And I'm co-moderating today with Tatjana Tropina. What's your last name is?
It's Tropina.
Tropina,
it's
just
okay.
Tropina.
Yes.
So, okay, good. And you work with the Max Planck Institute as a specialist in cybersecurity and internet governance. We have with us Fotjon Costa. He's over there. He will be the remote moderator for today. And we have Bastling Goslings from the M6 who will take the notes and make the report. Something that is important is that we also have remote captioning. This morning I made the mistake to point to a gentleman in the back and say that he is doing all the captioning. But in fact there is somebody all the way in the US who is listening to this and capturing this. And could you type your name into the captioning so that we can recognize that? We're now waiting for you. Lesia Mervin in California. Thank you, Lesia, for doing that work. It is highly appreciated. Goed. So, trust. Let me ask you a couple of questions, panel. Louise, when was your trust last violated?
Well, as you know, you last violated it at lunchtime when you told me this panel started at 2 o'clock. So got here, I rushed up. I couldn't do my shopping for my husband and my children. So anyway, but I think more seriously, I felt it was violated when Ross from Google said yesterday that security and privacy was on the top of every engineer's mind when they were designing devices for the Internet of Things, because that is absolutely not my experience.
Marit, do you trust your partner with your passwords?
I have my passwords on a sheet of paper and partially online in various places, because I think all in all I must have more than 50 of them, which is a challenge in terms of management.
Yeah. I did count 951 for myself, by the way. So, Konstantinos, when we walk into your house and we look around, and your laptop is open and your phone is on, laying around, and the game console is there, there's a bunch of cameras. How many are there in your house? How many lenses with cameras?
Actually, none. But I know the problem very well because I used to work in the Data Protection Authority. And nowadays, everywhere, there are cameras, which in my opinion, in my experience, I don't think they add a lot in trust. And perhaps there are less violating, so to say, measures to achieve this.
I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, roughly 20 cameras here in the room, all in your laptops, probably not covered, and microphones. So we can be sure that...
Who is covering the cameras on the laptop? Well, plenty of people.
Reiner, I see you have an iPhone there, and I know these things drain batteries. When is the last time that you put the charger cable in a foreign device, like an airplane seat?
I cannot. Do I need a micro? Or
Yeah.
well, I cannot really remember when I did it last time, but I don't think that I really thought about it, because trust is a question of good and bad experience, and I have to say. Maybe I am only a lucky one in the room here, but I was not disappointed, or there was no damage in the past, which gave me a bad experience. So I would say my general rule as behavior is that I'm trustful and not suspicious, and that everybody wants to surveil me and gets my data and so on. No, I'm trustful unless I make a bad experience. Yeah.
Right. Okay, these were just some teaser questions. This is not really the topic of the conversation. The topic of the conversation is going to be set by you all. What we're going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to have you all ask questions, share observations, share ideas of how to make sure. And I think that I want to focus it a little bit to the perspective of how do we make sure that users continue to trust the internet that they interact with on the long term. What are the things that we need to consider going forward in order for users to trust the internet? What can we do from our perspectives? That's government, private sector, civil society. What are the things that we can do? So that's the question. I want to ask you all in the next 20 minutes or so to provide that perspective, ask questions to our panelists, and then after that we'll give the panelists 30 minutes to reflect on what happened in the room. Then we have 10 minutes of more audience participation, so to speak, and then after that we will wrap up. We might divert a little bit from this. If a specific theme starts to develop, we might want to go around on that theme for a little while, but we take that as we flow.
So those of you who were on the first panel know that I'm the unknown person, and if no one raises the hand, I will come to you anyway. Marco.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of expected this joke. Let me break the ice. Hello, Marco, Gewoon Rijp, NTC. quickly jump back to what Leah said in her closing statement on the first panel, and that's we have to start again. I'm not so sure we can. This is sort of an evolution. This is not something we can just go away from and then try again. The internet is there, and we have to deal with what we have. So how to increase trust, and then also coming back to the points I made in my earlier interventions, I think this is more about people than it is about technology. This is about humans, especially when you talk about trust. And my last comment, I said, like, we're very reactive. Everywhere we discuss cybersecurity, we're always discussing the incidents. We're always discussing finding the people who did something bad. I think we have to turn it a bit more proactive. But in an environment where we only highlight the incidents, how can we establish trust? The people on the street all day read in the newspaper are security incidents, big hacks, data leakage. So I'm not advocating we should become less transparent. In contrary, I think we should be also more transparent and be more advocating what we're actually doing to make this world a better place. Not only focus on the incidents, but show how we are responding to those incidents and how we are making this a secure environment. And also then take into account that we do it in such a way that the person on the street understands what we're doing and understands that they too can play a role in making the ecosystem more secure, because they are part of this online ecosystem, they are part of this internet, and so they also have to play a role in making sure that this is becoming a more secure and remains a secure environment.
So, do you have a particular approach that you follow yourself that is positive? An example?
Well, one of the examples, I think, in sort of showing what we do positively is also in my work. I spend a lot of time training cybercrime investigators in understanding the internet and actually helping them to find those people. And we also always encourage them to show the results of those investigations and show people that it really makes sense. It's not all doom and gloom. We do manage to capture those people, and sometimes we do manage to bring those to trial who have stolen data or who have abused leaks in the system. And we should continue to do that. There is a way out. This is not something that we can't solve, but everybody has a role to play in solving it.
So basically what you're saying is not considering cybersecurity as a result, but as a process and being more proactive, if I may sum up.
Yeah, there's
a hand here.
There's a hand over there. Yep.
Sorry. Yes, I also saw that Nigel was going to contribute, and he was burning with impatience.
Again, Sasha from University of Sarajevo, I talked in a previous session. I think the key word would be openness. As I think Ian mentioned, we need to trust that nobody planted anything that we don't know in the products we use. And I would like to make a distinction on the security. We have two parts of security. One is tools, and the other one are procedures. For tools, basically IETF and some of the commercial companies did a great job for the tools. So I fully trust the tools, most of the tools, because they're open source, they're built on open protocols. Procedures are something that when we discussed, I think Nigel mentioned that we discuss on a different places, I think we always talk about procedures, actually policies. I think that for the policies, they need to be open in a way that each actor that's kind of affected by the policy needs to be included. In that case, nobody can tell that their opinion was not heard. So openness would be the key word.
This is something maybe later for Konstantinos also about Network and Information Security Directive. If I were Olaf, I would have asked you another question. How last time did you get, when was the last time you got grilled about the openness of Network and Information Security Directive development? But you might answer this later.
Good evening, citizens. My name is Angelos Karlaftis. I began to have an interest about the cybersecurity in 2008 when I made a Facebook account, and in 3 weeks they were gathered, according to our political and philosophical ideas, 3,000 citizens all around Europe, and suddenly Facebook closed the account without any reason for 4 years. So I investigated the issue. I researched, and I'm a genuine researcher, how it's working, the whole stuff on the S&M engineer, from the engineering point of view. And I began speaking in the European Commission in various ICT workshops about what we are going to do. From the legal aspect, because I also researched the legal aspect, there was no any kind of conclusion, because either the big brother in USA, who owns the net, the justice had only some results on similar situations, which for the citizen it was a matter of investment of time and money, which most of the citizens they don't have. So we have spoken with a German professor in Berlin who was very good during that time in the legislation issues, and again we didn't find any kind of result. So we don't, as Europeans, we don't have trust. All the citizens, we don't have trust. But we can make trust, as we are suggesting, by making the CNET our internet, which the user can interact and can be bridged with the internet of today. Our internet, the CNET, can be as the Galileo system, based and be instituted by the universities and the SMEs. On the contrary, our big brother has it on the military under a covering of non-profitable organization. Because we have to have in mind that our digital economy is not going to be developed if we don't have our own internet. The officers, according to our suggestion also to the DG on the agency which was 5 years ago, I think it was instituted, they created special agents for each territory to look over the issues.
Can you get to a summary
Yes.
of the point, please?
Yes,
The
I'm
point
going
is
to
that
cut it.
if we are speaking for Europe and Mediterranean, we have to construct our own internet, our own digital economy, which can be competitive and also collaborative with other zones, territorial zones, and alliance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nigel.
Yes, thank you very much, Nigel Hickson. I really just wanted to follow up on the point that was made right at the beginning in our panel this morning, which I thought was very good, and thanks to our chair. Leah, I think, encapsulated something at the end when she said, should we reboot? Should we start again on cybersecurity? And I think there's a serious point here, which it would be good to get the panel's reaction to in terms of trust, because I think trust has to be earned. And once trust is lost in institutions or in other entities, then it's very difficult for those same entities to get it back unless there's a fundamental change.
I think that was exactly what the previous speaker was sort of alluding to, yes.
And I think as we discussed this morning, because trust has been lost perhaps in government and government institutions in terms of cybersecurity, how does that, where do we go from there? Thanks.
Any more questions?
Walter Natris. I think, well, if we are to reboot, which I don't think, just like Marco, is really possible because we've developed too far for that. If we look at cybersecurity, and it's mentioned before, it's so broad, what are we discussing? If it's national security, you're talking to completely different set of people from a government than if you talk about digital rights or private rights. So in other words, find the people that you want to discuss a specific topic with. And if you do that, make sure that they come to a panel and discuss it with you. And that is my personal experience, and I'm going to reiterate it, it takes 3 meetings before something changes. In the first 2, they're only looking at each other. This is a very odd person that is sitting next to me, and it's a bit scary, but there's another one there, so I better sit still as possible. And the 3rd meeting, and that is really what I've seen happening time and again, we have common problems. And then they start discussing solutions and start listening to each other. But you have to invest and have to have somebody who is dedicated to start that process up and continue that process. If that person is not there, nobody's going to show up the second time.
So I hear what you're saying. What I try to do here is focus on user trust in the internet. So not trust between institutions, although we might meander there, but I wanted to start off with that. So getting various institutions to tables and have them create solutions for things that bother us collectively, does that necessarily create trust of the ordinary user? Will that make my mother more confident to go on the internet and do her business there? So, I've got...
To answer you, I think that it would if you identify the right things to discuss, because in the end, the institutions can solve the problem and not the individual end user. So you have to address the concerns, but with the right people at the table, which includes civil society, which will probably represent your mother in one way or another.
Hi, Luis van der Laan. I joined the ICANN board in October. I just wanted to get a reaction also from the panel on the observation I've made, since I come from a completely different background. Everyone in here is part of the internet elite. I mean, the fact that you're here. And I think the thing we have to think about is, you know, Olaf's mother, who we want to go safely on the internet. Most people actually don't care how it's done. It's like with food. You buy it in a supermarket, you expect it to be safe. You go on the internet, you expect it to be safe. You want someone else to take care of it. And I think most people expect governments to be the one to do that. So the question is, how can we help the governments provide that? How can we deliver that? Because, and is it even possible for governments to do this? And this is where, and they're under serious pressure because they're facing all kinds of threats. They're trying to find solutions, and the real problem is that governments have a huge responsibility. Governments are under pressure to address serious issues, terrorism, pedophilia, all these things happening, and at the same time they lack the technical skills to actually find the solutions, and sometimes will take a bulldozer to kill a mosquito because they don't know how to just get the mosquito. And so one of the challenges is how we get those different planets together to make it work.
I have to say that this is a very valid intervention. When we were just planning the session, we had to shape it from the proposals we got. And most of the proposals were actually concentrating not on the user's trust. We brought this perspective here and now. Most of the proposals were concentrating on how do we trust governments, how much of the intervention from governments we need, how do we build trust between stakeholders. But of course, when we are talking about trust, it's like this dichotomy. Sometimes it's like chicken and egg debate. We don't know what comes first, governments, users, or companies. But this is a very valid point to consider in this discussion.
Sorry, I had to respond. I was kind of letting Wout go with his comments about us technicians being scary, but you raise a really valid point, Luis, and that a lot of people think that technology is scary. And as I just tweeted, it's, do you know your system administrator? Because you were used to know your butcher and your baker, and we kind of moved that all to the supermarkets. Eventually we found our trust broken because it wasn't actually beef we were eating. And at that point, you kind of see government step in and regulate and monitor and measure. So open question to the panel is what can we do as an industry to make people sort of trust us as technicians and trust technology enough that we don't end up in a very regulated world that we now see with our food industry?
A very short intervention.
Yes, the response, I'll give you the response gave yesterday the very good judge of the Belgian state on the internet issues, Mr. Kerkhoff, who's told, I can make any kind of decision as a judge, but I cannot implement it.
Well, that would be another question for the panel or maybe for the floor. Even if we have governments intervening, what about enforcement? What about actual implementation of what governments can develop? I'm sorry, there was...
So to capture the flow of the conversation now, I think, going from user trust, we've sort of arrived at the place where we say the governments are the conduit for that user trust to be established. But they can make policies, they're not in the position to implement. We're now at the question, how do we make sure that things that are being proposed can be implemented and what's the role of industry there? Is that the right captioning? Just
I
looking around a
think
little
this
bit?
is the right captioning. How many interventions we can take more?
Well, we have 4 minutes and 53, 52, 51.
Thank you. My name is Severin Waterbley. I work for the government, so for once, because I think there are not so many representatives from the governments here. I work for Belgium, for the Ministry of Economy, and I'm a member of the GAC as well. So I really appreciate, sorry, I don't understand directly to your question, but I appreciate the last intervention, because as you know, there is still a lack of trust between, and it seems to be the debate since this morning. I have the impression there is a lack of trust between the civil society and the governments. I don't understand this in Europe, because I think we are living in a beautiful world with democracy. So I really appreciate your intervention, because it's really necessary for us. We are no specialists, of course, we have our own specialists, but it's really important to work together. I think that we have the same aims. We launched in Belgium the Cyber Coalition. It was a private initiative, and we're working with the telecom operators to try some solutions. But we have to work in a European context. So you speak about laws, about enforcement. Of course, in Belgium we have our own laws, but we have to work in a European context. And of course, someone spoke this morning about this directive NIS. It's very important, and now we have a sort of coordination, and the laws has to be European laws, otherwise it doesn't work, because of course, as someone else mentioned this morning, the attacks come from other parts of the world, so it's very important to have this coordination. But I was very happy to hear just a hand, because this morning I was really frustrated to hear so many lacks of trust with between the government and the civil society.
It's an issue to address in the panel. I saw a hand over there.
I saw two hands over there. And
yeah, and then we need to close it off because we have 2 minutes, 28, 27.
Okay, I'll make it quick. My name is Auke Pals. I'm a Dutch youngster. And my question to the panel is, how can we find the ideal compromise between all the different interests that all the stakeholders have, like government, civil society, and companies? How can we do that?
Hi, I'm Gord Lennox. I used to work in the European Commission. I've been doing this sort of thing for a long, long time. I'm an old European, not a young Dutch guy. Two things. I'm one of these people who've used the internet for a long time. I should be really comfortable. But I'm finding I've got two problems these days. One is surveillance by websites. I just checked. It says here 161 websites stored cookies or other data. And this is one of the browsers I use, because I use two browsers to stop total surveillance. But that's probably since yesterday. Because I think I cleared my cookies, or most of them, yesterday. I have not been to 161 websites, to my knowledge. When I go to a newspaper, suddenly I'm going elsewhere. So there's a scale of surveillance there, which I feel I'm uncomfortable with. The other side is the government side. My first meeting with NSA was in Brussels, probably at the end of the 1980s. It's been part of my day job to be under surveillance. But I fear now that a lot of people think that our governments are the enemies, and that makes me feel uncomfortable. We all live in democracies here, and yet somehow, why do we now feel that governments are now the enemy? I do know that when we worked, I think Nigel and I worked a long time ago on if I remember correctly, on the OECD guidelines on security. We all chatted, we reached a consensus. Last minute, the governments came in and said, when it comes to national security, the gloves are off. And somehow we still have this idea that with military might, we have the Geneva Convention. When it comes to the cyber world, there are no rules. I'd like there to be clearer rules so that I could feel more comfortable in not be in conflict with my democratically elected government. I think that, so I want to work in both areas. I want to work in the commercial open internet and make it clearer what I can trust, what I can't trust. And a lot of it's to do with surveillance, not with cyber incidents. And I want to work with governments so I know that I'm not an enemy.
Thanks. A very short.
A very short
we are
intervention.
done.
No.
And we came back to users' trust again.
We came back to users' trust again.
A very short intervention.
But with a very specific
Thank you.
angle.
It's about the industry, because we are not having any kind of industry apart from Athos. We are discussing here as Europeans, and this is not good for our allies also, because they don't have competition. For Google, for Facebook, for Twitter, for whatever is not European, and we are, the king is naked. And also, yesterday it was mentioned that when the judges and the justice system cannot implement, when the military is outside, when our satellites are selling our services to the terrorists, because ISIS cannot have any kind of presentation to the internet without our permission. How this is a democratic element which we are fighting for this, and a lot of us are fighting by being hunger, by being on the streets, by working very intensively on the democratic element. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Over to the panel. We had a full circle, I think, from user trust to governments as the conduit, industry as the implementer, user trust in the government, not only in terms of their processes, which is one aspect that we discussed this morning too, a little bit, but also the impact of state surveillance and industry surveillance, another aspect of trust. Those had clear impacts, complex world. But we have, I think, a number of perspectives at the table. So who wants to give? Go ahead. Yeah.
Just listening to this discussion and also in the morning, I would like to go a step back and wonder myself, is it really a fact and so sure that we have to rebuild trust? I mean, this is a topic, it's a narrative. And if you read, for example, proposals from the Commission or other lawmakers, most of them are in the sake of rebuilding trust. It's about data protection, rebuilding trust, cybersecurity, rebuilding trust, even if the production on organic food, rebuilding trust. And I wonder whether really there is an empirical study about whether consumers don't buy organic food because they think that it's not produced in the right way. And on the other hand, you have a situation where you see the internet is growing, the services are developing, and my impression is not that people don't use the internet because they feel that there is a lack of trust. And even if there is a lack of trust, the question is whether there is an impact. We had the situation in Germany a few years ago that we have a big social network. It was a German social network, and I think it's not a surprise if we say that the data protection rules were better than the terms and conditions of Facebook. Facebook was only the second social network in Germany. So everybody was complaining about Facebook and the terms of condition and data protection policy. But it took only 1 year, and they were the biggest one in Germany. Although there was no trust, they used it. And the other social network doesn't play any role at all at the moment. So I wonder, what is this discussion about trust?
Is that something that Luis just said? Like, we're here as elite, and is that I'm just rephrasing what you just said. Is this because we are the elite and we look at this with a completely different perspective than most users?
No, let me finish my sentence. My impression is that you have some kind of a general mood for policy making. And I think the easiest separation is if you go to the States, there's always a campaign, and the big issue is hope or fear. It's always the same. It's hope or fear. Obama was hope, Bush was fear, so it always can change. And what is interesting in the whole multi-stakeholder process and the whole discussion, that my impression is when I came to the first IGFs and EuroDIGs, there was much more hope. It was about the sake of the internet, the good points, and so on. And now we have a discussion that's driven by fear. By fear, by lacking of trust, and we have to regulate in a way, and we don't trust governments and everyone. But this morning I didn't hear any point concretely what we have to do. What is the point about cybersecurity? What do we have to do? No, it's more a general, oh, we don't feel good. So I wonder whether this is a very productive approach on the multi-stakeholder process and on getting some issues done, even if you have to do in the end to draft some law and to find some decisions.
So I'm going to do a shameless plug. We have this collaborative security approach, and one of the things that I'm trying to test here is whether what we're trying to do, what I hear, fits in this approach. And one of the principles that we try to apply is foster confidence in protecting opportunities. And that is in the realization, I think, that the internet only just works. People always, find the right balance between risk, and that just continues working. It's rather fragile. Anyway, it also resonated with what Marco said in the beginning, by the way, a positive approach. So I think that's a good takeaway.
I think trust is important, and I think trust is really about confidence that our value exchanges, whoever they're with, are fair and equitable. And I think what was said about in the real world, if you know people, you know whether you trust them or not. I think the absolute key thing on the internet is to be confident about the identity of the person or organization that you're actually interacting with. So I actually think the key to trust on the internet is identity management and identity assurance. And as a shameless blog, anyone who wants it, I have a thing here which we've just published on how to recognize a good online identity scheme. And in Europe, we have a whole lot of identity schemes of different types in the different countries. Most of the countries in Europe base their identity schemes on ID cards. In the UK, ID cards are absolute anathema. We do not like ID cards. They tried to introduce it, the last government but one, and it was a complete failure, an enormous database they tried to produce. Now we have a scheme that has gone live last month because it had to go live according to European law by the 1st of April, which is a federated identity scheme. So it's, we have private sector identity providers, 8 of them, to verify your identity to a certain level, not the very highest level, but to a reasonable level to interact with government, and they hope it will be taken up in other places. In some of the Scandinavian countries, very sensibly, I think, they use the bank ID schemes, the credit cards. And although we all say we hate banks and we don't trust them after the banking crisis, actually, most of us trust using our credit cards to do interactions on the internet, buy things. One of the reasons we trust them is because we see the little lock and we think, oh, that's safe, it's doing. They may do 2-factor authentication. They may give you a dongle and you feel even more confident because you're doing that. But also, we're confident because they accept liability for what we're doing. If something goes wrong, the credit card company will pick up the tab. We aren't losing money. Now, these are all important things, and I actually think there is a very positive way forward, and I'm very positive about things. We need to federate all these different types of identity schemes, ones that people in different cultures, different organizations are happy with, happy to use in different situations. As long as we have open standards for them to interact, then we can have a successful, trustworthy internet where you can buy things and feel confident, you can sell things and feel confident, you can interact with your government and feel confident. And very importantly, I think we're missing a thing. I think Alibaba has a very good e-commerce strategy. You have Alipay, and Alipay stands in escrow between the seller and the buyer. You only get the goods once Alipay is holding the money. And I think escrow, a trusted third party, is a very important element of developing trust on the internet, giving everyone confidence that they will get things. And so I would, I put that out as a way forward.
I think I hear what you're saying. The model of federation is much related to being able to spread and create meshworks of trust. And I know there's a lot of work going on in these areas so that assertions being made about identities are standardized. I believe NIST is doing new work on that. And I fully subscribe. But of course, it's not the magic bullet. It's an important foundational technology that you're talking about. Yes.
I would like to ask the question to frame it into our previous debate about governments and companies and users. Yeah. It sounds very appealing to have these standards. Who is going to actually impose them? It's voluntary, right? Am I understanding right? Or do you think the governments have some role to play? How far this goes if you think that they have to intervene? So voluntary or co-regulatory or pure intervention? What would be the answer?
I think you have to have open interoperability standards. Mm-hmm. Open standards that are understood by everyone and accepted by everyone to interoperate between the different trust networks. And I think government has a role. It can't force its citizens to do X, Y, or Z. You can choose, but you need to understand some very complicated things to choose, and that's what we try and cover here. And we're saying there's not a single right answer, but these are all the things you should think about, and this is why you should think about them. And I think that's the way forward.
I see people in the audience raising hands, but I'm not going to go there. We're going to take 20 minutes with the panel now, and then come back to the audience. So
unless there is some pressing issue.
Only very pressing issues. Oh, okay, there's a very pressing.
Sorry to take the floor again, but I will be very short. We have we have a European regulation on the ID, so we have open standards, so we are working on it. It's now, we are working on it, but it exists, I don't remember, since last year. We have trust services, so everything is in the law, in the European law, so I don't understand the point, actually.
Yeah. Was it your intervention?
Yeah, because since July of 2015, and now it will come into force, 1st of July 2016, we have the Electronic Identification and Trust Services Regulation, which more or less sets the mandatory framework around the usage of electronic IDs. And I think that what Luis said makes absolutely sense. But now, apart from the federation schemes, we have a framework around the identities in order to operate in a proper, so to say, manner. So and towards the security and trust of the citizen.
In your opinion, there is a need for regulation. I mean, apparently you are probably supporting this framework.
In European Commission's opinion. Usually, European Commission intervenes whenever the market doesn't work.
Well, in fact, there is the e-cigs and e-trust regulations, and that's why the UK has had to rush in, well, we've been taking a long time about it, rush in a scheme and say that it's live, which it kind of is, to meet that regulation, because we're the only country in the EU that doesn't have an ID card. We've done it in a different way to the rest of the EU, and it is for cross-border signature of contracts and so on. However, there are big problems for people in the UK with those two regulations because they're based on the premise of Napoleonic law, and we have common law, and it is actually very hard to obey them with our law and our rules of precedent. So there are enormous problems in the UK with those regulations.
So, Konstantinos, just other reflections on what we talked about, because I was sort of going through the panel, asking for reflections on that arc that we went through.
First of all, I would like to claim that I don't have the solution. Okay, I have some thoughts, which I don't know where to start with, to be honest. We were discussing a lot of these matters internally, you know, with other experts, NISA, with multiple stakeholders, and so on and so forth. One observation is that if you notice all the cybersecurity regulations, the obligations are set to the end part of the value chain. We are talking about security in the telecommunications sector. The obligations go to the telecom providers. We're talking now with the NIS directive about security obligations. The obligation goes to the providers. With the electronic IDs, the obligations go to the TSPs. So if you notice, there are no obligations for those who provide the providers and the end users with the equipment or the software. The bottom line is that your computer, your mobile phone is your interface to the internet. You access all the internet with these devices. So nobody sets some rules or security requirements how this interface should be built as regards security. We started discussing and debating a little bit with different stakeholders, and we had realized that it's not easy to put these requirements, not only for lobbying reasons, because the most important thing in a multi-connected and multinational market is that you don't know where to set a barrier. For example, when you're talking today for a vendor, actually it's not one vendor. The vendor has some vendors. So other components are produced in North Pole, others in South Pole. So where the liability lies? And this is very difficult when you have to make an intervention to decide in order to improve the situation. Because as already said, it's true that there is no obligation for those who produce devices and for those who produce the software. How can you push them to follow better practices? One might say, okay, let's put an obligation for secure procurement, for example, to require from utilities, from end users, to set some security requirements, and these security requirements should be followed by the vendors. But again, there are many, many difficulties to create a common, so to say, list of security requirements.
It's a very funny mistype on it's scrolled out, but there was a requirement for a superhuman.
Because in order to set a meaningful set of requirements, you have to be very, very detailed. And this means that eventually the requirements should be on an ad hoc basis. Another idea was certification. Okay, let's adopt a certification scheme for Europe, which doesn't exist, for example. This is wishful thinking. But we face numerous problems when it comes to certification. Let's go, okay, to the solution of testing. Yes, nice. Compromise. Somebody spoke before about compromise, which is, my opinion, is the key. But against what? Is there any pan-European acceptable set of requirements that we can test our devices or software against? No. So this is only a set of thoughts, as I said before, because I don't have the solution.
Specifically towards a minimum set of security parameters to be implemented when products ship. That's sort of the minimum amount of security that you're thinking of. Yeah.
Because this is one point, how can you strengthen the end user trust? Okay, these are thoughts. I don't have the solution. And if there are some thoughts, how can we put the barrier where we stop? You know, at which point of the supply chain we can put the liability? It's more than welcome to hear.
I think we have one pressing intervention. Marco was raising the hand. And while I'm walking there, I want to connect it to what we were talking about during the first session. You can have set of rules, but how you actually enforce in this decentralized
global market.
Global market. So Marco, is your intervention pressing?
Yeah, no, I want to, we have 7 minutes left on this block of panel intervention, so I want to give the floor to Marit.
Okay, so I will a bit go back to the roots of user trust after the, let's say, more institutional setting. And I was thinking, Olaf, you asked in the beginning, Luis, so what was when was the last time you lost trust? I think he meant on the internet, but you know. And I was thinking for myself, there are a couple of occasions I can think of. And one thing that really ticks me off is when the social media platforms such as Facebook or Microsoft Hotmail, when they ask you for your phone number. And they say, please provide us your phone number. This is for security reasons. Thank you. And in some cases, it's even impossible to log in unless you give it. Now, I just then log out because I don't want to give them my phone number. And I would say that this kind of boils down to the control of your data. So from my perspective, one of the major components of user trust is the control over your own data and, you know, how much of that you can do. The other example that's recently happened to me was, well, not so recently, in my previous job. There was an Adobe update that came onto my laptop, and you know how we are. We're working, something pops up, you just click OK. I clicked OK. There was all these neon-colored bugs that started running around my laptop screen. Thankfully, it was my work laptop. But there I would maybe classify it under user responsibility as well. So, okay, maybe it was, in this case, an SME that didn't have sufficient security system, but maybe it could have been myself as well, a bit more, you know, diligent with my clicking, etc. So, going a bit to the control of data, so companies and also governments through surveillance, they are collecting, sharing, processing, storing our data. And I think the two big cases that we are seeing in today's discussion, it's the data economy, so mainly user vis-a-vis the large internet giants, if you like. So where is the trust relationship there? You know, are they selling my data, etc.? A lot of paranoia there. The second is then the point that we discussed about the governments. So, you know, is it necessary for government to have my data, etc.? And I think if we don't link it to the national security, the European framework, I think I'm personally fairly confident with it. So data protection, etc. There are still some gaps, namely data storage. You know, there's some legislation that remains to be reviewed, but I think that is going pretty well. The second part is then the private sector responsibility, and I think there, you know, there should be some progress on how we can manage this data economy a bit better. When it comes to the infrastructure, I think, as many of you mentioned, a regular user doesn't really have the means to judge or assess whether the infrastructure of my ISP is good or not, or whether the vendor equipment that they use is solid or not. So you know, it really comes to the openness of the processes that they use vis-a-vis your data. So I think I will end there. One, I wanted to mention on the trust labels. This is something that I know that in the European Commission, many events, and I've been participating, it has been discussed in certifications, and especially vis-a-vis the Internet of Things, because the worry there is that, you know, when you start plugging in new devices, how does a consumer know that this device is not going to, you know, ruin my Wi-Fi network at home, etc. So I think this discussion is quite an interesting one, and probably the kind of heavy certifications that we see in other areas and other sectors may not necessarily work in the area of the internet, whereas a trust label, maybe for a device, might be something that supports a consumer choice, you know, not a kind of voluntary scheme, if you like. So I will park it there, Ola, for now.
Thank you. Bastiaan, could you do us a favor and give us a sort of a overview of what you as a reporter have heard so far?
As usual, I promise that you're going to do it in brief 3-4 bullet points.
I will certainly do my best. Thank you for that. Well, we started off by, I think, establishing that we cannot start over again technically. We build upon what we have. And when we talk about trust, we talk about human beings. That was essential, I think, to establish as well. We need to be more proactive than just talking about incidents. And if we want to make a world a better place and have the average citizen understand this and engage them, that's something we need to work on. And if we do that, a number of people said, you know, that they trust that we can solve issues. But everyone is part of it. Everyone has a role and a responsibility. Interestingly, someone said here, raised the question, we are talking amongst each other here, but aren't we an elite for thinking of the average citizen? Most of the people don't really even care or not aware. They expect their governments and expect, I take that as a sense of trusting their governments to take care of it for them. But if then a government makes a decision, or public officials, or even a judge, how then to technically or to implement and enforce decisions that have been made? Someone else said that more and more people tend to feel that the government is the enemy. So how does that work in our democratic societies? Trust, you know, I think that was the main theme that we talked about. Someone even said, do we actually need to rebuild trust? Is there a real problem? Yeah. Aren't there trends? A couple of years ago, we were very hopeful, and the tone of the discussions were completely different, and now it's more dominated by a sense of fear. An interesting point that was made as well with regard to trust, if you think of the identity aspect of it, and a couple of developments there were discussed, and also a regulation on a EU level that was established that should help there. And finally, at least from my perspective, an important element with regard to user trust is the ability to control your own data. So how much control do you actually have, especially when using certain social media platforms? Where is the trust relation there?
So yeah,
summary up until now.
That's good to hear. So a couple of trends. I think a sort of a technical trend. What is the infrastructure needed that we can build upon? That technical trend is not set in motion, but it's not complete yet, I would figure. A policy trend. But also this trust between the entities and the outcomes of the processes. So those are the things that I, you know, as a 3 branches heard here. We have 10 minutes now for you to respond on all of this.
I count 3 people in the queue now.
Yeah, we have 3 people. Go ahead.
More coming.
But I'm trying to get us to focus a little bit, and I'm sort of fishing for that focus. I think we would be doing ourselves a benefit if we would walk away with a sort of conclusion here. So help me provide some focus and respond to each other and see if we can converge to something. Let's try that.
I absolutely agree with you, but I would also make a small amendment to this add a regulatory trend to the policy trend?
I'm really getting comments. I should lower my time on there. So here we go. Very quickly, but that sort of Louise triggered it a bit, and that was sort of followed up by the comments from Anisa, and focusing on the regulatory trend there. Yes, it's good to look at supply chain and the responsibilities there, but I would also say look at the complete value chain, and that includes the end user. Yes, my credit card has some security built in. When things go wrong, they pay. I'm pretty sure I pay it myself via some means, because it's certainly not coming from their profit margin. But it also only pays when I'm not doing anything stupid. And you gave a wonderful example with like Alipay and escrow. Yes, the industry is building a lot of tools and a lot of things that can help users to secure their environment and be more secure. But it's ultimately the user that has to use it. To draw an analogy that we came up with in IoT earlier on. Yes, the car manufacturers didn't put seatbelts in voluntary, so they got regulated to put them in. But ultimately also you have to find the end user for not wearing a seatbelt, because otherwise it won't help. And so what I really would love to hear the rooms for is on what's the end user responsibility when you enter into liability for the suppliers. Because then also somebody else is liable when they do something wrong.
Sorry, just a question. So do you think, a question from moderator, do you think we have to regulate end user responsibility? Yes or no?
No. Well, I do think if you regulate the industry, you should also take into account end user responsibility. It can't come from one side.
Thanks. First, I saw the hand here.
Thank you, Marco, because I want to go further on that one. We have been discussing legislation, we have been discussing private sector and all the obligations and all the rights of the consumer. But we tend to forget that the consumer also has some obligations. As my CEO this morning, or the first day of the EuroDIG meeting in the plenary said, like the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. And the Googles and the Facebooks of these days, they do know their power, but they also know these days, they know they have their obligations, including with the new GDPR, they know what's coming their way. So believe me, the private sector, they will know that there is risks involved, and they will not just use your data for things they are not allowed to. So I'm a bit, let's say, surprised, but also annoyed when I hear people say, and then they ask me my telephone number, and I don't want to give them my telephone number. Well, it's a security measure, and they will not use it for other purposes. It's because if you block your account, etc., etc. But I want to take it to the domain name industry. I'm the legal manager of EuroDIG, so the .eu, and when we have an authoritative whois.eu to know who is behind the domain name. So I'm now talking domain names only. The internet is much broader than that. So, but when we take it to the domain name, I can say with quite some certainty that 80 to 90% of the complaints we get on abuse on the internet will relate to domain names that have inaccurate data or fake data. So for me, a big concern is the privacy services, the proxy services, and even the obfuscating services that some of the registrars are getting into, which means they get the data from their customer and they just do some weird things with it, and it ends up in our registration database, and we can't do anything with it because it's just bullocks data. So if we have to give the whois to the public to let you know who is behind the domain name, nobody knows who is behind the domain name. And that's a big trust element on the industry. So if we allow people to hide on the internet, I'm not saying that we need to give up privacy, because the way we do it, when you give the registration data, which is correct, your personal data, we only show your email address and your language. So people are contactable via our whois on a domain name. Without knowing, you can have a Gmail or a Hotmail address, but if you're not contactable, we will, and we will not show your private data, but we know who you are. So in case we need to give it to law enforcement, etc., then we need to use the data for those purposes. But we will not show it to the public. So there is, people always say about cybersecurity and privacy, there must be a balance. The balance is already there. But it needs to be made clear that it's not only the industry having some obligations, people online, going online, individuals, we're all consumers. We also, from that perspective, have some obligations and responsibilities.
That, just to throw in my own perspective here, that resonates, that general approach of being responsible, feeling responsibility for the public commons that the internet is, resonates a lot with me. I always say when you're on the internet, you're part of the internet. And that means you have a responsibility to keep it clean. As an end user, that means, install a virus scanner, please. For instance, update your software. And I think that also moves into the responsibility of paying 10 cents more for something that has a little bit of a higher security standard. But anyway, I'm digressing. I'm on my own soapbox now. Let's see. We have a few interventions still.
Yes. Hi, Stacey Walsh. I'm going to go back just a step because I had a comment about an earlier topic about how the interplay of governments and citizens and organizations and where the trust is and maybe not trusting governments anymore or organizations. And I agreed a lot with what Marit was saying. And I would like to take it a step further and say that we can't say that we definitively do or don't trust governments or organizations, because what we're doing is we're really getting into the weeds of cybersecurity. And if we don't know exactly what kind of cybersecurity, air quotes, we're talking about, our trust relationship with that entity will change. So right now when it comes to data protection, we are trusting and we are looking to our governments to go and to regulate that, to put in some kind of structure for that. The new EDPR is going in, and that dates back to when governments first started digitizing data in the 1960s, and that's when you got your first data protection laws in government. So that has a long history and resting within that kind of trust element. Whereas if you look at national security, which has, for history of the world almost, been a very private, closed conversation within governments, there is this shift happening, but they're not opening in the same way that governments opened when they put in data protection laws. So it's more about thinking about what we're talking about and finding the right resource to open up that conversation, rather than saying I do or don't trust somebody. Because in Apple versus CIA, well, I trusted Apple because CIA isn't being open with me, so why will I be open with them?
We have one or 2 minutes.
There.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Ludmila Georgieva, Austrian Permanent Representation to the EU. I already mentioned in the morning the NIS Network Information Security Directive, the General Data Protection Regulation, the Directive for the Data Protection for Law Enforcement purposes. I think there are quite a lot of issues which have been rebuilding trust, in order to quote Rainer. I think trust is something Vice President Ansip always said 50% of the people don't trust to the internet, that's why they don't use it. So here is a huge economical maneuver where we can, if you rebuild or if you build trust, or you can, trust you use all the time. Negotiating Network Information Security Directive, you hear it like 28 times in a round. But I trust in government, for example, in the Austrian government, because I know they are acting on a legal base. So everything they have to do, they're doing on a legal ground. The question is, do I trust to entities and private companies, what they do? Trust is also have to do with my skills. So do I know, I'm aware what they are doing, what happens when I am booking a flight online, which happens now in 15 minutes. 20 years ago, it took like 1 month in order to obtain a flight to go. You have to go to the
travel agents, you had to pay cash, you had to give your post address so you can receive
Isn't
the copy.
the internet beautiful?
Exactly, but the point is digital skills. We learn to read and to write and to count in schools in order to interact with all together, but also with government. But we don't learn in schools how to interact in the internet. So and the point is trust. As far as I know, what I am doing and what the opposite is doing, this is also cybersecurity. So as well, I'm sorry, I have 3 points more about the Facebook, about the telephone number. Facebook asked me several times. I didn't want to give them, but suddenly they suggested me to put my number. I don't know where they get it, but they had the number, probably from other people who have WhatsApp, and they have my number, so they just suggested, is this your number? So something about trust. And I also would like to have cybersecurity, but also maybe data security, data protection. This is everything connected. And again, cybersecurity, digital skills. I didn't hear about it, but we have to also educate people, and this is the end user responsibility.
Clear
you cannot
point.
ask...
Clear point. Capacity,
exactly.
skills,
You cannot ask
important.
for responsibility if you don't know what are you doing over there.
Yep.
So I'll make here a point. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have two more interventions,
Yeah.
and we are closing.
keep them to 30 seconds, please.
I'm going to watch it. I'm even going to get like this, so in the worst case, I will just take it back.
Hi, my name's Nick. I am from the UK government. I apologise, I missed the earlier session on this, so I missed some of the dialogue. Wow, what a great discussion, and loads of points. I think I'm maybe public enemy number 1, going by some of the chat. Trust, really interesting issue. I work similarly at ICANN. I'm on the GAC. We've had doing the IANA transition, and trust has been the big key feature of a lot of the debates. For me, personally, my fundamental trust in the internet as a whole is that it's decentralized. It's this decentralized operation where no single entity is in overall control. And I think, whether we decide we like Facebook or we don't like Facebook, on whatever, this decentralized network and the way it's sort of set up gives us the ability to then take a choice, and say, oh no, we don't like this, we're going to go and use something else, whatever. And open standards, we have the IETF that developed these open standards, and so I think this decentralized network is core to trust. 2 seconds, and so we need to maintain this. There are pressures elsewhere. In other institutions to have greater governmental control of the internet. I'm sure people all around this table wouldn't like that. So I'd say, as Europeans, make sure you go and speak to your government people like me and say, get involved in those debates and defend this open, decentralized network and promote the multi-stakeholder model. So I'd just like to add that tidbit.
Music to my ears. I know. I heard that inviting him to the ITF actually paid off.
Hello, Anna speaking. So back to what Marco was saying and the follow-up question from Tatiana about making users responsible for their security and privacy protection through regulation. A century ago, a car was something very new as internet, and those who started driving and using the cars had no idea that one day someone would give them €40 penalty for not using the safety belt, right? So it is as not imaginable for us to be held responsible for not being stupid, for being stupid at online as it was back then. So I believe that at some point we need to stop taking the government and private companies as our parents and always relying that they will be the ones providing us security and privacy. But we need to start becoming responsible, and I love this multi-stakeholder responsibility thing, and I put users in the very center of it. So if we need a regulation to make users responsible for their protection, for their privacy protection and security, I think we can start discussing it, and I think we need to take care of our digital security as important as our physical. So
thank you for that intervention. I'm now going to go back to the panel and give them 2 minutes each to respond. After that, I'm going to ask Bastian to make a summary.
4 bullet points.
To make the 4 bullet point summary. But in the meantime, I have a question to the audience and the panel between those two things. So first, your 2 minutes. Who wants to start? Marit?
Yes, why not? Well, there was a large range of comments, so I don't think we're expected to answer to all of them. I would like to pick on Nick's comment on decentralization, and I think that's not a bad thing. I agree with your comment, and I know that the European Commission, I was in a previous discussion with them a few weeks ago, and they were saying, we were talking about passwords, identity management, and they were talking about the centralized system that the European Commission will provide to citizens to allow us to use one password for many things, and there would be some kind of guarantee by the governments to keep us safe. And I asked the question then, and I would like to raise the point again here, that I don't necessarily feel better if a government has, that all my identification methods are centralized into one pot somewhere and the government is, let's say, watching over it. That doesn't necessarily make me trust the internet more. So I do like your point about the decentralization. And I also would raise a point kind of on behalf of the technical community. I like Marco mentioned that, RIPE NCC as part of the technical community, they work with law enforcement, they do technical training, with the view of allowing policymakers, law enforcement to understand the ways of working of the internet. And recently again, I was in an EU meeting, and there again, this was very officially now recognized in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago. And they even had now a box called involvement with or engagement with hackers. So they have, in fact, and they nicely called them the technical community, but they're now even using hackers, as kind of training, etc. So I think, it's not only about governments and private sector and even users. We also have to then make sure that the technical community and the guys who know the internet are involved somewhere along the way. So I will leave it there.
Hackers are not per definition bad people, by the way.
There was a very nice hacker guy who was talking. He was very nice.
It's people who like to tinker with technology and try to find the limits of technology, and that's an important feature. Anyway, go ahead.
So I will conclude that user trust is a multifaceted principle which devolves around some key issues, accountability, as I said before, with identity management, control of data, the confidence that technology works secure and privacy compliant, transparency and openness, and awareness and user responsibility. I think that are the most important elements of this concept.
That was far less than the 2 minutes I had planned for you, Constantinos. Thank you.
Okay, well, I can use a bit more than 2 minutes then. I think a very important thing for trust in the internet in the future that we haven't touched on properly, although it's come up in the questions both this morning and this afternoon, is the question of the security of the Internet of Things. And I think that is something that we should really be thinking about very hard now. And I'd just like to bring up 3 examples of where I think it's important. I think it's most important where there are safety issues. And so we've already seen stories in the paper, people around here, I'm sure, who have read them, about the Internet of Things in cars and about intervention with those causing accidents. These kind of things should be covered in the safety regulations. I think the other area where it's really important, and trust will be lost if we don't do it properly, is things to do with health and social care in the Internet of Things, which are tremendously valuable in that area. I had to look after my mother with Alzheimer's for about 15 years, and one of the things we had was sensors that said if you'd got out of bed, gone downstairs, opened the front door, and all the rest of it. At that time, it was relatively unusual for someone to be monitoring their mother remotely in that way, and I could alert people to help her. Now, I would be really frightened that there wasn't proper security on any of those systems that I was buying off the shelf and installing around the place. And I think it's incredibly important that we should regulate about the safety of systems used in health and social care. And the other area, we've talked a lot about privacy and security, and I think there are consumer goods where I think the IoT is very intrusive, and the one that comes most obviously to me is TVs that actually watch you as the audience, record what you're saying, see your reaction to adverts and things. Now, most people who buy smart TVs don't actually realize what they're garnering in your home. And I think...
Well, it's mentioned in the terms of service.
Well, yes, but I mean, not everybody reads all those terms of service. And I think on all of these things which are truly privacy intrusive, the default, we should say, is that you opt in to using it, not having to opt out. And I know that that is hated by people who want to sell you those things, but I think that is the privacy-friendly and correct way to operate. And I think that is the kind of legislation that our governments could bring in. So I really wanted just to touch on that because I think it's such an important area that we haven't had a chance to talk about.
And you just took 10 seconds off Reinier's time, but he's going to get the full 2 minutes.
Sorry.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. So I missed already 3 seconds. No, my main question is, what does all mean this in practice? I mean, for a policy or lawmaker, what is the conclusion of all this discussion? And I like to give an example, just to explain where we have sometimes even more problems if you come to transparency, informed consent, and all of these things. So if you think about airplane security, would you feel comfortable if the airplane or the air carrier would provide construction plans of the plane before you enter the plane and saying, please read this, and then you can confirm and give the consent whether you find this is secure or not. I guess not many people would feel very comfortable with this solution, but this is exactly the solution we found in data protection regulation. It's informed consent. Everybody has to read terms of conditions now, and then he has to decide whether he's feeling comfortable with the service or not. In the end, nobody does it, and we shift responsibility to the user. Instead of saying, okay, maybe it would be more appropriate to have more general rules for the providers or for the services. So that means in the end, this was, for example, a discussion driven only by trust. Rebuild trust. We need informed consent. That sounds very good. But if you see what it means in practice, you come to a very, very poor result. You say, oh, that's the solution. Oh, no, that was not what I meant. I meant a totally different thing. And I think I can only give the advice for a multi-stakeholder process, and if you would like to involve the governments and get them engaged in this process, come to practical points, come to also examples, come to maybe proposals and very detailed things, because a discussion on a very, very high level might sound comfortable to each other, but in the end, if you implement it, if you see the consequences, it's not exactly what you wanted to do. Thanks.
Gather together on a topical basis is what you're saying. Yeah. So, before I'm going to hand over to Bastiaan for a summary, here is a assignment to all of you. close your eyes and think of the divine intervention that you are able to make. You can impose a trust-enhancing measure. What would that be? Please tweet that with the EuroDIG 16 and the EuroDIG SEC hashtag. It's for your audience. And for the panelists, I'm going to return to you after Bastiaan and ask for your divine trust-enhancing measure. What would you impose on humanity?
And don't forget that it should be in 140 symbols.
Go ahead, Bastiaan.
Thank you. I'll skip the previous summary I did halfway. And what I took from the second part, I think from the start, what I found interesting is someone who commented on the fact that we cannot say that by default we do not trust governments or private sector organizations. It is very important to agree when we talk about things on beforehand, specifically what we are trying to cover. The example was mentioned by Stacey, for instance, with regard to data protection legislation, right? That's a transparent process, people can reflect on that. And on the other hand, we have like what we see that security agencies do, maybe for legitimate purposes, but that is, all of that is very hidden. So exactly what are we talking about if we, for instance, are referring to governments? All I've made as a comment, which I found interesting as well, halfway, when you are on the internet, you are part of it. And that brings responsibility for the end user. I think that was, at a certain point, we were very much talking about the role of the end user and the responsibility that she or he has. But if you talk about this particular responsibility, and also the trust that comes along with it, it's not as easy as it sounds. It requires skills. Do you actually know the specifics and the details of what you're trying to form an opinion about? Do you have the time and the access to do so, to enable to have an actual opinion? This requires capacity building. I think that is lacking to an extent. I like the comment that Nick made. I added as a point as well. As essential to keep the trust is from a more technical, neutral perspective, the decentralized aspect of the internet as a network of networks, and the open standards that are used and able to connect everything together. And also the call to actually involve with your local national government, to inform them and to help them participate in the multi-stakeholder discussions in order to protect these essential characteristics of the internet. And last but not least, at the end of this session, a couple of new items came into play. I noted them down as well with regard to accepting terms of service, the role of informed consent. What does that actually mean? People do not read the terms. They just said accept them blindly. Another suggestion that was made to make people explicitly opt in instead of opting out afterwards once they've committed to something. That might help to gain trust in services. So that was it.
Thank you. So most of the people I see here were in the first session, and we're going to do the hum. That is, I'm going to ask you whether this was a fair reflection of our summary, a fair summary of our panel, and then or not. And you can hum on both of these questions, and then we get a sense of the room where we are. So please hum that way if you think that this was a fair reflection of the panel. Please hum if you think this was not a fair reflection of the panel. Thank you, Bastiaan.
Thank you, Bastiaan.
And so now, your divine intervention panelist, Konstantinos, please.
Let me sit down and go for a walk.
There is a microphone.
Anyway, I think education. I think a lesson on all European schools about internet and how to use internet.
Marit.
Yes, I think we need some kind of virtual platform to break the security taboo and openly talk to each other.
I think trust is enhanced by transparency and simplicity, and so you should have a traffic light system for good security and privacy.
I enjoy discussions like this, but I would even more enjoy discussions also with more practical and real input in what policymakers could do to make it a better and safer place.
And with that, thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panelists. And have a good continuation of your EuroDIG day.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, there are beautiful brochures in the front here, and also at the desks downstairs you can pick up all kind of good material. Yes, I am.